All right. Hello and welcome back to another episode. So my name is Matt Codde, and in this episode, what I want to talk about is the idea of a fear of hurting yourself or hurting someone else, right? And so this is a common fear, typically in that kind of OCD spectrum, we'll call it. You kind of have these intrusive thoughts about what if I hurt myself or what if I hurt someone else, right? And the thing that I want to point out about these specific fears, right? This is the thing that makes these fears, and not like the difference between fears and impulses, are this idea of these thoughts being ego dystonic, right? So I really want to separate that for a second. So the first thing I want to talk about is what's ego dystonic versus ego syntonic. And ego syntonic thoughts, right, are thoughts that align with who you know you are and things that you want, right? They're aligned with, what your ego, right? And then dystonic, right, ego dystonic are thoughts that don't align with that. They're the opposite, right? And so when we talk about these fears of having thoughts about hurting yourself or hurting someone else, it's important to understand that these aren't like, hey, I want to hurt myself and, feeling, or like, and then having a response to that, right? And actually having desires to hurt yourself or hurt someone else. These are thoughts of like, I have this intrusive thought that, what if I did this? What if I snapped and hurt myself? What if I snapped and hurt someone else? And the thought is so distressing because you know it's the opposite of what you really want. That's what makes the thought ego dystonic, right? And so when we're working with a fear like this, right, it's important to understand, right? So kind of a couple components here, right? The first is that we need to understand the thoughts of ego dystonic and ego syntonic. So that's like the first thing that we want to look for if someone's dealing with that. And the fact that someone's anxious about the thoughts is generally a good indicator that the thoughts are actually ego dystonic, right? Because people who really want to hurt other people, they aren't bothered by those thoughts, right? It aligns with what they want, right? Which is, if that's what you're dealing with, or you're seeing someone who's experiencing that, and that it's an alarm, like a big red flag, right? And I've had a situation like that where I was asking the person, they're coming to me and talking to me, and they're asking me like, hey, I'm having these thoughts. And I just kept asking, like, okay, like really trying to understand what's going on. And the thoughts had no bother to the person. They're like, no, I want to do this, and so that, just to separate that for yourself, really that response of anxiety to the thoughts is a good indicator that those thoughts are probably ego dystonic. So then once we understand that that's what we're actually dealing with, then we begin to understand about the idea of diffusing from the thoughts themselves, because one of the big things that causes people to really get stressed out about thoughts is thinking that the thoughts that they have are them, right? That voice in their head is like, it's them producing the thoughts, which is why it's so alarming. But realizing that a lot of thoughts that we have, we have tens of thousands of thoughts a day, they happen, right? They're just random occurrences in most instances. And when we understand that, we begin to understand that we're the observer of our thoughts, right? And we can respond to the thoughts. We have conscious decision of how we respond to our thoughts, not necessarily the thoughts that we experience. So once we begin to shift our focus as to, we're not trying to control a thought or even our emotional reaction to the thought, but the behavior that we're engaging in when that thought happens, right? And that's where we want to shift our focus, right, to controlling the behaviors, right? Always coming back to that. And so if you're doing a bunch of mental, right, so that's step 2, right? So first is the separation of between ego dystonic and ego syntonic, and then beginning to diffuse from that voice of the mind and shifting our focus to, behaviors, right? Like what are the behaviors we're doing that are perpetuating this, right? Because what will happen with these thoughts is people will get locked into a cycle, right? So they'll have these harmful, intrusive thoughts pop in, and then they'll engage in certain behaviors. Now, these behaviors can be things like avoiding sharp objects, right? Because if you have intrusive thoughts about, like, knives and things, then you'll generally avoid knives. Or if if they're revolve around driving, oftentimes a person will avoid driving. So anything we're avoiding is going to be something that's going to reinforce this, right? And then also, there's also mental behaviors that people engage in. These things can be things like trying to push the thoughts out of our head, trying to replace them with good thoughts. silently pray, as well as counting, distracting yourself, analyzing, like, okay, like going through your whole past to see if you ever did anything like that, or like, I mean, there's so many things, people can engage in. And that's why really understanding those behaviors is critical to your success, as far as, overcoming this particular fear, because what we have to do is we have to start systematically eliminating those behaviors through exposure and response prevention. And then, once we begin to do the behavior treatment, right, then it becomes more about acceptance and commitment as well to, learning to accept the presence of thoughts that you don't like. And what that means is really allowing the thoughts to surface, right? Not engaging the behaviors and committing to living towards your long-term values. And I know that's a very broad, general overview, but I mean, I just want you to kind of understand the fear from a high level. Because these fears of intrusive thoughts, whether they're towards yourself, of harmful thoughts, right? So you could have fears that you might hurt yourself, or fears of hurting others. The real big shifts for people when it comes to getting better from this is understanding the ego dystonic and ego syntonic part, learning to recognize when the thoughts happen, your external triggers, as well as what behaviors you engage in. And one of the things where people, really struggle with is really identifying all the different behaviors that you engage in. And so, over at Restored Minds, we have additional resources for you, whether it's behavior inventories, as well as, additional trainings on how to actually, identify all the different behaviors you do, further trainings on, that voice in the mind and really breaking free from that. So, if this is something you struggle with, we really encourage you to check those out. We have some links down in the notes below. And if you found this video helpful, we'd always appreciate you sharing and liking and subscribing, because, again, that helps us get this out to people that need it. So, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And I hope you guys have a great week. I'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you found it helpful, chances are someone else will too, and we'd really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing, and also sharing this video on your social platforms. Also, if you're looking for additional help, we have some resources right down in the links below to help you on your journey. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you soon.